I'm going to introduce John. He's one of the founders of Studio AMD. He's going to be talking along with Gordon Tarpley today. So, John, I want to pass that over to you, and maybe you can do a quick introduction of yourself and your company, and go from there.
Sure. Welcome, everybody. Sorry I'm late. We ran into some traffic outside. We're from a small city. We're not used to traffic jams quite like that. But I'm happy to be here and happy to be able to talk to all you guys. Studio AMD, we founded in 1992. We've been around a long, long time. We were using 3D Studio for DOS back in the day, and we really have remained a small shop that does boutique kind of illustration. We tend to try and go after fancy schmancy architects and developments, and our main business is really doing stills, not really so much doing not doing animations or films. And one of the challenges that's kind of really manifested itself over the years, what I'm going to talk about as a business owner, one of the challenges we've always had is personnel, and just being able to hang on to personnel once they reach that age where they can really make a big difference to an image in a short amount of time. And how do you make their lives better, basically? And so a lot of the lecture today that I'm going to give is how to make their lives better, and then just talk about kind of our workflow, which is a really up close and personal look at our workflow that we've really spent the last 2 or 3 years kind of germinating an idea up to now where it's full fruition. And it's really trying to attack how we see images that are great, or that we think are great, developing, and what the characteristics of those images are, and how to get to that place faster with your senior people, so that way they're not the ones sitting there late at night, sweating it out, waiting for the client to call, and they're the ones sitting in the studio at 11 p.m. or 1 a.m. Has everybody been there? Yes, okay. Yeah, 4 a.m. So basically that's what we're going to talk about. We're going to try and talk about strategies to not have those final links of the chain put in place at the very last minute by your senior people, make their lives better, and we'll talk about that. We'll talk about that in a few. So, why am I not? Okay. So, like I said, we're going to be getting to painting sooner, because really you can have a lot more effect on getting a good image if you get to painting sooner. You need to know what you're making. We'll talk about that. We'll talk about knowing who the team members are, what their responsibilities are, what everybody's responsibility is on a daily basis. We're going to talk about when we recognize the different personalities that are involved in this business, and really where their strengths are. What then, if we had an ideal workflow, for our method, or what we consider important in an image, what would be the specifications for that workflow? And then we will talk about how we do it, which is the humble proposal, which is probably going to be the bulk of this morning's presentation. It's just kind of going through the absolute nitty-gritty, the proposal, and then the AMD project setup, and then we'll talk about just what that end game is. We have made you a great-looking image, and you hate it. And okay, I don't want to disappoint you. We're going to continue putting people into it. We're going to continue putting resources into it. How do we not lose our damn shirts on this job, basically? So that was supposed to be a joke. Did nobody thought that was funny at all? Okay, all right. Okay, good to know. Okay, the production curve. So here we go. Basically, this is how we see images working, and I think most shops probably have the same experience. And that is, you spend the beginning part of the time getting that phone call or getting that email from the client saying, "Hey, we want to hire you to do this job, or you got the job, or whatever, and we're going to have information ready for you on the 20th." Then the 24th rolls around, and you still haven't gotten anything, but you know that their deadline hasn't actually changed. Like, has everybody been there? Okay. So then you are on a frantic dash to be able to take care of your 3D modeling. You're waiting for info. You're sitting around twiddling your thumbs. You're waiting for info. Then when the info comes, you have to do all kinds of mad 3D modeling to get it to a spot where it's done. And then you start sending off wireframes to the client and getting the approval on the wireframe. And you're waiting on material specs, you're waiting on absolutely everything, and you're trying to frantically get through this thing. So that's really this first part of this curve. So basically, if we look at this graph, this is just very general. The efficacy of the image, how effective that image is going to be in the final. In the final, when it goes into the newspaper, when it goes onto the website, how effective is that image going to be versus the amount of time that you are spending. So that first stage is incredibly inefficient. Right? That first stage of this production curve is incredibly inefficient. You are having to, like, you can change that curve with certain things. You can change that curve with an excellent library of models that you have. You can change that curve with some crackerjack modelers that you have, like, that are working for you. You can change that curve with, just having absolutely spectacular project management where you just tell the client where you're a genius, they're coming to you for your genius, and you can tell them, you know what, if you don't get that stuff to us on time, then you're going to go to the back of the line. That's kind of a hard thing to do. Like, many of us are not in that position to do as business owners. There are few people that are in this business that are paid to be geniuses. Most of us aren't paid to be geniuses. Is anybody here paid to be a genius? Right? So, like, basically, that initial phase is incredibly inefficient, and there are ways to ameliorate that curve down there at the bottom of it, but fundamentally, it's an inefficient part of the process, and a lot of it you don't have control over because you're waiting for the client to get you information. Okay? Second part of the curve, this steep one. This is when you're getting it into your lead artist's hands, right? They can, in Photoshop, very quickly take this from something that is absolutely mundane to something that is very nice. And this part of the process is what Gordon is going to be talking about this afternoon. He's one of our lead artists. And you can go from very, very bad, like some seriously bad renders that are coming out of Max that are terrible, that are wretched, right? And you can get them to something that's good, and you can go into the newspaper, and there are ways to beat things back, and because fundamentally, anyway. So that part of the curve is incredibly efficient, and that's really where most of you want to be living, right? That's where you mostly want to be living, because that's the part that's actually incredibly profitable, because you can take nothing and make it great quickly, But that's really more often in 2D than it is in 3D. It's more often in 2D than 3D. Then there's this part of the process, which is where everybody loses money, and that is the deadline changed, and it didn't change to get sooner. I always laugh when I go to CG Architect and I see all these people like, they changed the deadline on me, they moved it in 2 days. I'm like, that's great. Do you know how much your profitability just went up? Like, that's fantastic. Like, and now you can tell them that you're actually doing them a favor by getting it to them 2 days earlier. And maybe it's not quite as good, but hey, this is not the worst thing in the world. Deadlines sometimes are your best friend. You get into a land where you're working for a lot of developers, and you're not working for architects that have to report to developers. You work in a land where you're working with developers. You are living on that curve. You are living on that far end of that curve. They will comment you to death. Okay, that's the part of the process that they like. And you got to honor that. Like, I'm not. It's like if I was hiring somebody and paying them a lot of money to do me an image, I would want to make sure I got my pound of flesh, and that's what they do, and so that's where that line goes, and you see that goes to an absolute asymptote, right? It goes to an asymptote. You can put in all the time in the world, and that image really isn't getting any better. It isn't getting any better, if people like, well, what if we turned on more lights? It's like, well, yeah, we can turn on more lights, but it's going to make maybe a 1% difference, maybe a 0.5% difference, and it's going to cost me a whole day to do. it's just not worth it. Like, it's just not worth it. So this is the part of the process where we all lose money. So what we really want to do is we want to make sure that we have people that know what they're doing. We want to make sure that we have people on staff, people that are in the company that can do this stuff, right? Because that's really where you're going to make, that's really why clients are going to come to you, because you can take something and make it great, and you want to make sure you have people on staff that can exercise that curve. You don't want somebody that's fumbling around. Like, you can have somebody, if they're not a really good painter, right, they can fumble around, and that curve still is fairly flat, right? But if you have a great painter on staff, they can take that and make it fast, really quick in Photoshop. So anyway, so that's the production curve. Is everybody clear what I'm talking about with production curve here? Like, and we're not talking about specific man hours or specific efficacy of image, but we're talking about in general, like what the money app is. And the money app is either After Effects or Photoshop. Okay? Like, it's not Max. I mean, Max is great. V-Ray's great. We use Max, we use V-Ray. But that's not really the money app. Those you can tweak forever. And like, you can get better, and you can get better, and it can get better, and it can get better. But if you're just stuck on 3D the entire time, you're going to be on that bottom part of that curve until you get to the top. If you don't do any post work, you're going to be on you're going to be on that curve, at the bottom part of that curve. Oh, by the way, I was supposed to open with this, but with the frantic getting over here, I told my wife the name of the class was to work and to get home on time. And she said, "That's great, you should take that." So just one caveat out there. Okay. I was like, "No, I'm giving it." She's like, "Oh, God." All right. So knowing what you're doing, know this, there isn't one answer. There isn't one answer to any one architectural project. There's no one answer. This is the Kaufman House in Palm Springs. Incidentally, it's the same client that hired, this is Richard Neutra's building, but it's the same client that hired Frank Lloyd Wright to do Falling Water, interestingly enough. Frank Lloyd Wright, super genius. When they had a chance to do another house, did they go back to Frank Lloyd Wright? No, they did not. If you want repeat business, don't be in church, right? Okay. So, but that's not really why I'm pulling this one up. Neutra house. This is the same house in both pictures. Does everybody see that immediately? Okay. This, the one on the right was like the cover of Life magazine at some point in the 1960s. Just talking about the California lifestyle. That other image is probably one of my favorite color photographs of all time. Daytime, it's about 15 feet over from the first one. I think the difference between these two images, considering the only thing that's changed is the vantage point and the lighting in these two images, and obviously one's black and white, one's color. They're both great answers to the same problem. They're both great answers to the same piece of architecture. You just know what you're doing, like and that comes with practice. And I'm not trying to be facetious about it, but there is no one answer to what the best image for your piece of architecture is going to be. And so I think you need to keep that in mind, all right, because that will come back when we start talking about our workflow. There is no one answer. Like, you sitting there pounding your hand and saying, to the client, it has to be this way, it has to be this way, it has to be this way. You have to choose your spots where you do that, because there really is no one answer. Like, you can get great images, you can get great images doing it in different ways. So this is just a quick example of knowing what you're doing. Like, this is, and I should say this is Julius Schulman. Both of these are Julius Schulman, photographer, Los Angeles. Everybody know Julius Schulman? No? Okay. I would definitely look at architectural photography. That's a very great source of being able to do stuff, or get inspiration from. One, because it's a lot easier to take a photograph than it is to do a rendering. And so they can be a little bit more cavalier about just snapping off some shots that they think might be interesting and coming up with lighting that they think might be interesting. So I would definitely make sure that you spend time looking at architectural photography. That's whether or not you do it yourself, I don't, but whether or not you do it yourself, it's very, it can be incredibly informative. Anyway, so this is Julia Schulman, knowing what you're doing, just making a good image. Like, both of these are great images. They work completely different ways. You know, the one on the right is a lot more atmospheric perspective, right? Atmospheric perspective. They put the woman lying, like, who lies down by the pool in the middle of the night, by the way? But they put the woman there so that way she blocks the flare from the light in the pool. That's why she's there. You know, the path of the eye is, you know, up through the pathway and then into the mountains. Whereas on the right-hand side, you can see all the yellows working from that foreground piece of furniture up on the right-hand side into the unit itself. So there's kind of a seashell shape of yellows doing this, right? And then there's a seashell shape of blues doing this. And in the middle, you have this graphic of this building. Okay, so it's working at a couple different levels. You're talking about the architecture, but you're also talking about the flat canvas itself. Okay, knowing what you're doing. Everybody see that? Everybody with me? Okay. Knowing what you're doing. This is Claude Monet. Is everybody familiar with this painting? Anybody familiar with this painting? Yeah? Okay. This is called Impression Sunrise. The entire Impressionist movement was named after this painting, which is fairly not dramatic, right? Like, does anybody have any idea why I'm showing this painting? No? Okay. So, knowing what you're doing, it's not really that surprising to me, though I don't see it really as a big thesis in art history classes. But photography came along about 150 years ago, right? 140 years ago. And all of a sudden, the traditional role of the painter as the person that would actually depict the scene became secondary to photography. And photography, you could go out and you could take a black and white photograph and you could get an exact likeness of somebody. You could get the rendition of their persona. You could get a rendition of the scene, and basically a photograph was going to be a lot faster and a lot more real than any kind of painting. So what did painters do? They started the first portion of the modern art movement, and the first portion of the modern art movement is basically Impressionism. And what they did with Impressionism is that they started saying, all right, well, you know, you in photography, you have black and white grayscale value covered. We see very clearly that when we're talking about realism, realism is in the values. Okay? Realism is in the values. What we're going to do is we're going to start experimenting with values, but we're also going to start experimenting with color. So this was something of a sensation because this painting went up, and all of a sudden there's this eerie orange sun in the sky. Is that orange sun kind of bothering people's eyes a little bit? A little bit? A little bit? Probably maybe not the best representation of this. However, what the Impressionists started doing is they started experimenting with the eye and how the eye sees, and they started expressing things on canvas as opposed to a pictorial space. They started talking about the canvas space itself. Does that make sense? This is a thesis in art history classes. Everybody had art history, and okay, so the Impressionists were really the first ones to do it, and I'll show you why. The reason why that sun is kind of like hanging out there, like almost like a peony or something, you know, just sitting there, just kind of like rotating just a tiny bit, and kind of you can't quite put your finger on it. The reason why that is because even though these colors, the orange and the blue, are very, very different, the values between, you're getting more rendition there than you should, but the values between that orange and that blue are very, 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 very close to being the exact same. And the way your eyes work is that you have a value system in your eyes, and then you have a color system in your eyes. And your value system sees things in one resolution, and your color system sees things in another resolution. Your value system sees things like space and sees things like atmospheric perspective and sees things like volume, whereas color, your color system it's a very low resolution system, and your color only really sees kind of broad shapes of stuff. Okay, so I don't care what gamma you're using. I don't care if you're using SketchUp. I don't care if you're using Form Z. I don't care if you're using ArchiCAD. Fundamentally, everything goes through your eye, right? And that's something to remember. Like when people talk about what the best render engine is, like, I don't care. You know, like ultimately it all goes through your eye. And when you start talking, and when you understand what's happening with your eye, and let me give the name of an author and a book that I would highly recommend if you're interested in this stuff. Her name is Margaret Livingstone, and she's a researcher over here at Harvard. Let me get a drink. And the book I would recommend is Vision and the Biology of Seeing. And this example is drawn for this. If you want to know why the Mona Lisa smiles, the answer is in that book. Okay? So it's important to understand here for me, like when I'm talking about architecture, I need to know, I need to really concentrate on my values. Like if I'm concerned with showing form, if I'm concerned with showing space, like color doesn't get it done. Color is purely ancillary. What gets it done is value. Okay, black, like grayscale, like, and you know, purple is darker than yellow. So don't get me wrong. Like you know, I'm not saying that you shouldn't interject any color, but fundamentally, if you want to talk about value, if you want to talk about space, if you want to talk about depth, if you want to talk about volume, you need to make sure that your values are good on your canvas. Okay, so that's something that, that's something that, you know, all good shops really, like you look at their work and it's evident. They know that. So this is ideally what we really should be shooting for, right? We should be shooting for, with this idea that that flat canvas is something that people see, right? And that flat canvas is something that there's no absolute answer for. That flat canvas is how we are going to, is a great deal of how we see our image and a great deal of what the overall emphasis of the image is. The sooner that we can start to get to painting at the beginning of the process, the better off we're going to be. Because we can initially run up the flagpole with the client, kind of sketches that we're doing. Meanwhile, in the background, we're working on our 3D model, right? And then at some point up here, we can kind of start to join those two together, and then we still have to sit on that goddamn asymptote just like everybody else. But fundamentally, that's what you're trying to do. You're trying to get to this painting place sooner, because you can have a lot more effect on those kinds of values. You can have a lot more effect of how eyes move across the screen if you're working in canvas space as opposed to working in 3D space. Does anybody have any questions so far? Does it seem like just stupid or revelatory or just like, shut up, dude? No? It's all right? Okay. Okay, so basically, what we're going to do is, and again, we're going to talk about this kind of stuff. So what we want to do is we want to attack this curve and try and get this kind of going early on. We want to have all the 3D modeling stuff kind of going on in the background while people are able to paint, right? Because you can have a huge effect on the final canvas just by painting as opposed to by 3D compositing or waiting for 3D renders to come out. So basically that's what we're trying to do. All right. Value. This is Albert Bierstadt, 18-something, Hudson River School. The eye comes in here, moves through the canvas here, comes back, looks at this, right? That's this painting. That's architectural illustration right there, as far as I'm concerned. That's different than visualization, as far as I'm concerned. Not that I'm insulting visualization. Visualization is making sure that everything looks photoreal and not really necessarily concentrating on the canvas space. Like, that's how I distinguish the two. So I'll try and keep that nomenclature clear. You know, when the client's writing the check, I'll call it whatever you want me to call it. But like, for the purpose of the lecture, for me, illustration is making sure that there's movement to the canvas and making sure there are places to stop to look at the architecture. So this is Albert Bierstadt, 150 years ago. Landscape painting. This is Mir, visuals. It's the same painting. It's the same painting, right? Your eye comes in, sun's over there, your eye traces, pauses here, pauses on the building, goes out there. Mir, by the way, they're like the best shop, right? Does everybody know Mir, M-I-R? They're great. William Clift, Albany Staircase, architectural photographer. Full disclosure, I flipped this image. I flipped the last one too, but same image. Eye comes in, goes up. Eye comes in, goes up. Pauses here a little bit. That's architectural illustration. This is D-Box. Same image. Eye comes up, goes out to the sun. Eye comes up, goes out to the sun. How many of your clients would ask for that sky to be blue? How many of yours would be? Mine would. Does this work if the sky's darker? No. Doesn't. Doesn't. Right? Doesn't. It's architectural illustration. You make that sky blue, it's a collage. That's what it is. Tom Schaller, same image. Eye comes up through. Eye has movement. There's enough places to pause on it, look at it. You get some volume. You get some volume. Eye comes up, comes through. It's about the movement of the eye. Hugh Ferris, all this full disclosure, I flipped this one too. Hugh Ferris, eye comes up, comes through, pauses on the plaza. Same image. Okay. So, that's not exactly formatted right. That's all right, you guys. I stink at graphics, by the way. But anyway, so everybody see those examples? It's the same image. Like, and that's not the only paradigm that you can use. You know, you put the sun over there and you get the, that's not the only paradigm that you can use. But there are a bunch of answers always to any one, well, not always, but there are usually some answers to any image that you can choose to do. And fundamentally for me, when I'm looking at work and when I'm saying that's good or that's bad, at some level, those people have thought. When I say good, at some level, those people have thought about how the eye travels through the canvas. And that, you know, and that's it. And some people don't even realize that they're doing it and they're great. You know, some people don't even realize that they're doing it and they're great. And some people are clearly like, they know that they're doing it and they're great, you know. So, but fundamentally, that's what I'm looking at. When I look at the distinction, you know, I talked to Jeff at some length about what people really want to get out of the class. Like, how do you take it to that next level? Like, he's like, we want all these people are saying, like, we want to take it to the next level. The next level is not that complex. The next level is you need to think about these things as canvases and not necessarily as 3D models. Like, that's it. Like, is there any questions about that set? Oh, I'm going to go. All right. Just joking. Okay. So anyway, so that's kind of the goal. So everybody kind of understands where I'm coming from as far as what the images that we're making. Now, on the other side of that, like, who are the people that are generally involved in this process? And I just kind of want to break down our typical office kind of workflow and the responsibilities. So we have a project manager, and their level is to basically interface with the client. Their level is to work on, we'll talk about the render pass file. We'll talk about that, and that's what most of my demo is going to be, is talking about that. They're delegating tasks to all the people that are on the team. They're troubleshooting, and they're getting stuff to render overnight. Senior artist is responsible for painting. Okay, they're responsible for compositing the image, and I will use compositing and painting absolutely synonymously in this talk. Don't get confused that I'm saying something else. So we use painting, but it's compositing, same thing. The senior artist is also going to be responsible for directing stuff back down the chain of command, making sure that comments get back to the senior people, or the project manager and the junior artist. The senior artist is usually responsible for like super complex, like ZBrush type models that just need to get done. Senior artist is usually responsible for really fairly complex materials that need to get done. And they're also responsible for troubleshooting and getting ready to render every night. Junior artists typically are the younger people, and they're coming in and they are coming usually from a 3D background, okay? And they are responsible for doing models, basic materials, basic lighting, and they're responsible for the flat line curve, right? Sorry, flat line curve. They're responsible for that flat line curve. So once the senior artist has basically finished their PSD and got it, like it's not going to get significantly better. Hopefully, it won't get any worse, which is always the worry. Right? Are we there? Is everybody with me on that? Like, very often, client comments can drive it to worse. The junior artists are there to kind of manage that asymptote because they're generally a little bit cheaper. And generally, you want to be grooming them to the point where they're comfortable working in a PSD environment where they can start to actually they can get promoted eventually to senior artist. So you really want them to see up close what's happening on that. So those are generally the roles that we're talking about. The top two, you pay them more money, right? You pay them more money. Bottom one, you don't pay quite as much money, but you care about them, but you don't pay them quite as much. Okay. This is from Jeff's CG Architect. And this is about 10 years ago, my partner and I, we were like, we had a talk one time. We were like, so-and-so is about to turn 30. Yeah, he'll be quitting soon. This is the age group of who are in our industry. And you can see junior artists, 20, 29, right? What is it? Does that say 29? Or does that say 20? Anyway. It's yeah. You guys know what Jeff meant, though, right? So basically, our industry is 85% people's in their 20s and their 30s. Now, part of that is the age of the technology, and I fully am cognizant of that. But you see, and we have personally seen, droves of people that have come through our office and then they get out. Has everybody else seen that? They get out of the industry. No? I mean, the graph here is pretty clear that we're not alone in that situation, right? That people, once they start getting into their 30s, they start having families, that fundamentally they get out of our industry. And because, and I can only surmise this because we're not exceptionally well paid, right? We have some fun, but we're not exceptionally well paid. We also have this situation where we're just absolutely always dependent on what the client last said to us. And we are just slaves to notes, and we're slaves to render times, and we are slaves to just being there at the very end to get the image out. Do I describe everybody's lives basically? Like, I don't mean to be like facetious. So, I don't blame them. So they get out. They get out. And so right when people are getting to the point where maybe, oh my God, like she might be a really good painter. We got to bring her in to make her a senior artist. It's like, you know what? I'm going to quit because this just isn't for me. Like all of that adrenaline that I had in my 20s for working till 11 o'clock at night has given way. And I'm not really that interested in killing myself for this job anymore. Right? Okay? That's sorry, that shouldn't be news to anybody, right? That's not news. Like, I'm not breaking it. I mean, Jeff, do we have any whiskey? Because I think people are getting kind of down about that little message there. All right, okay. So anyway, so basically, so this is what we're looking at. So you can see in the last, like we have project managers, we have senior artists, and then we have junior artists. And you can see, like, this graph here. And I don't want that kind of world. Like, does anybody else want that kind of world where like everybody just feels like the first 15 years of their career they just thrown away? I'm on a mission. I'm on a mission to change that. So that's why we're here. Let's talk about this. Okay. So, this is the worst. I was like, Jeff, like this is the worst graphics on the face of the earth. But I feel like since you're giving these out as recordings, it's basically reading. So I'll format it like a damn book. Okay. So lessons. I'll give you some time to read it, and I'll just talk about it. Obviously, you can have a great deal of effect on the final look of an image if you can start to paint it before you wait for the 3D model to be done. Right? We've seen that. Between the Monet and the Julius Schulman, night view especially, where he dodged and burned that thing to, within an inch of its life. You can have a great deal of effect of that final image much more efficiently if you're working on it in 2D than if you're working on it in 3D. Okay. If you wait for information from your client who are in the most stressful 2 weeks of their life up to that point, and they really want to get their design, really the brass tacks down on it before they share anything with you, right? And honestly, I can't say I blame them. They're designers. We need to recognize that these people that are on the other side of that business deal are really trying hard to impress their client or their potential tenants. And they have a big presentation coming up too. And they're going to be stressed. And I always feel like you really want to give them as many benefits of the doubt as you possibly can give them, right? Because they're in a stressful situation as well. Just because your turnaround is like every 2 weeks is your client's most stressful 2 weeks of their life, right? So we go from one project to another where we're dealing with people where it's the most action-packed, pressure-packed 2 weeks of their life. Even if it's not the 2 weeks of your life, it's, am I being clear at all? Like just a little human kindness towards your clients. It goes a long way because they're under a lot of pressure as well. That's really what I'm trying to say. And so they're trying to get you information, but they're not necessarily, you're not necessarily at the top of their list because they want to design this thing and try and impress their bosses or whatever. If you are in a situation where we've actually had, when we used to do work in our old workflow, we had a project manager whose wife divorced him because he was home late every night. Every night he was home late because he was waiting for all of the junior artist stuff to come across his plate before he could submit anything to render or for the overnight deal. Right? This is a problem. This is a problem. This affects people's lives. Right? It affects people's lives. So if you're waiting for, if you are the project manager and you are delegating everything, if you're waiting for everything to come back and the end of your day is waiting for people to generate work and give it back to you, you're going to be there late. You're going to be there late. It's not going to be fun. You're going to be there late. Okay. If you render during the day, please, God, don't render during the day. Does anybody here render during the day? Okay, good. Okay, so I don't need to dwell on this, at least for the crowd here. Don't render during the day. If you're just paying people to look at buckets, what it means is not only that, what it means first off is it means that you're paying people to look at buckets. It means they're going to be there late. It also means that if your passes aren't, so you start passes at 10 a.m. and they get done at 2, that means your senior artists are going to be there late too. And there's no value there. There's absolutely no value. So you get the image to the client at the end of the day. What are they going to do? They're going to comment on it, right? They're going to comment. When are they going to comment on it? Probably first thing in the morning. And then you've started the process all over again. So you're frantically in the morning trying to take care of the 3D notes so that way you can render it again over lunch, so that way your project manager, your senior artist can also be there again late at night painting it again to get them another round, right? It is a horrible, horrible situation to be in. You need to structure your days where you are not rendering during the day. Just not doing it. Now, you can render little pieces. I'm not saying there's no rendering. You render little pieces of it to test stuff out. But it is a horrible cyclical schedule to get into. Does everybody see the logic of that? Right? It's a horrible cyclical because basically you're waiting for, you end up paying people to sit there and look at buckets. You end up having your senior people staying late, and you end up just absolutely being frantic in the morning trying to take care of 3D notes so you can render it again over lunch. Okay. Now, we generally like to keep our render times like small, like 90 minutes, 2 hours to get through all of our passes for any one given image. So that way we can render it over lunch if we absolutely need to. So we like to do it so we have that backup plan in our back pocket. If we absolutely positively have to, we can kind of put our passes into the queue, render them, and they'll get done in like 2 hours, 90 minutes. But we try like hell not to, because there's really no value in it. Like, other than making the client feel, other than you promised the client you would get them something that day, and your pass is overnight messed up, and you just feel honor bound to get them something, there is no value in getting them images at the end of the day. There's just not. Okay? It's just going to make your life hell. Okay. If you put too much on any one person, they're going to be there late. That goes without saying. Okay? So you need to find a way to be able to make sure you fracture work up, make sure you extend work out over the project length, so that way, not everything comes down to that final 2 days. As much as people love saying that expression, thank God for the last 15 minutes, otherwise nothing would get done. You do kind of want to avoid that, because that just, it affects your health, it affects your marriages, it affects everything. So, okay. Last one, project manager. That's redundant to what I said before, I think. Make your project manager stay late for everybody to be able to finish their work. They're going to end up divorced. I mean, it's not a good situation to be in. Okay. Anybody have any questions about that? Have I given everybody enough bad news? Yeah, go ahead.
So this is an issue that we're having at our office when we were talking about the different roles, and saying that the ideal scenario is that the project managers always communicate with the clients, but what we found is that 90% of the decisions are taken during those meetings. And if the project manager doesn't have the artistry to communicate or to guide the client in a certain way, then we're bound to what the client wants. So at some points we've shifted our structure, and we have our senior artists attend those meetings, where the end result is that we have an effective communication, and from day one we have a better guidance, but at the same time, our senior artists tend to work late hours because they're attending meetings and not doing the painting and composing job. So yeah. I'm just curious to see how your office deals.
It's an excellent question. I think part of my experience, unfortunately, is that none of my clients are in my city. Like, I almost do everything. Like, we're in Providence, Rhode Island, which, when there's no traffic, is about 15 minutes away from here. But today it was not that way. But that we rarely will take any kind of meetings that are on site, generally speaking, to be honest with you. And I think we've really replaced that with an idea that we're trying to get them updates almost every day, so they don't really feel like they're out of the loop. Like, it's every day or every other day. And so that way they just see that we're working on it. They feel they can steer it if they need to steer it. And then generally, and I should also say that our project managers do also come from architecture or painting backgrounds. So I think that I do have a special case in that our project managers, I do feel like they can talk art a lot more successfully than maybe some other shops might have in that position. But you're absolutely right. Like, having a creative director there, or we've seen projects when we've had project managers that haven't been quite as comfortable talking about canvas space. Inevitably, I end up having to kind of weigh in and come into the meetings and say, like, look, this is just not a good idea. Like, you need to push this darker, or you need to push this lighter. So I totally hear what you're saying, and I think that I'm colored obviously by my own experience. No worries.
I'm also curious now that you say that you upload images every single day to have that kind of constant fluent communication with the client. We've been also kind of back and forth between those decisions. Sometimes we feel that it's better for the client to wait 3-4 days until we have something that is 90% finalized, so that they have, so that they understand exactly where we're going and have less room to change. But at the same time, we also want them to feel comfortable with our flow. So I don't know what you're...
Yeah. Well, I think it depends on who your client is. If you're working with an architecture firm, I think they just get anxious. If you don't share with stuff with them, like 3 to 4 days, like they're going to be going out of their minds. Like, are you guys working on it or not? So I think that's it depends really on your client. I think it's an excellent question as well. We obviously, like I said, like most of our clients are not in our location, so we prefer to just throw stuff at them just to make them feel like we're working on it. Like, even if we send them, hey, this is horrible. This is horrible. Like this is a horrible looking image, but we're sending it to you because it's on its way, and then we'll send them an example of something else that we know that it's going to look like in the end. And just say, like, look, this is horrible. This is a first step. Our options are, we can either show you how the sausage is made, or you can sit there nervously wondering whether or not we're working on it. Like, that's your options. You don't have any other options other than that, right? If you want us to hold back, we can certainly hold back. But you're very clear with them up front. Like, and last week I was having a discussion with a client. He's like, do you have anything? I was like, yeah, I have something. I don't feel exactly comfortable sending it to you yet, but I can send it to you if you want to see it. And he's like, yeah, I want to see it. I'm like, all right, here it is. It doesn't, I mean, it's, you know what I mean? Right? I mean, you got to play each situation how it is. I mean, I certainly wouldn't suggest sending something that looked bad. Like, it's, a couple weeks ago we were in a situation where something was looking bad, and we'd been at it a couple days. I was just like, ugh, and they were in a hurry, and I was just like, I don't know, man. Like, why don't we do this? Let's just send them good-looking wireframes. Like, you're much better off sometimes sending clean wireframes than you are sending your first initial images. But you're getting the discussion going, and you're just like, you're giving them something, so. But you do need to calibrate it. Those are all excellent questions. They really are. I'm not. But it's okay. Okay. So to even stuff out over this thing, our ideal workflow would allow us to start working as early as possible. As early as possible. Ideally, on the day that they tell us they're getting us the information. That they tell us they're getting us the information. Whether or not they get us the information. Ideally, you've set aside scheduled time in your office. You have 2 people, 3 people, 5 people, 8 people ready to go on such and such a day, right? That ideally your workflow would allow you to start on that day, regardless of whether they've actually gotten you the information. Wouldn't that be nice? Wouldn't that be nice? Be able to start work on it then? You sound unconvinced. You're like, those are my days off. Everybody's looking at me like, those are my days off. Like, don't make me start working on a day when I don't have anything to really do. That's what everybody's looking at me like. Okay, all right. Allow you to make changes to stuff that your client typically gravitates to. You can do the nicest rendering in the whole world. Like, you know how it goes. It's just like, I don't like that lamp. I don't like that tree. I don't like that person. What's her hairdo? That dress looks like it's from 1987, blah, blah, blah. Like, you want to be able to make changes to stuff that the client really kind of typically gravitates to, okay? You want a workflow that allows your senior personnel to get home earlier. Your senior personnel are the ones with families. Senior personnel are the ones that they've gone through the adrenaline-fueled 20s, and they don't really want to be there till 11 p.m., till 1 a.m., till 4 a.m., okay? So in that, your senior artists, primarily, they're doing their work in the mornings. Project managers, your end-of-day responsibilities should be as absolutely turnkey as possible. So you can, even if people are still working, you can walk out the door at 5:30. How does that sound? How does walk out the door at 5:30 sound? Doesn't that sound good? And not come back after dinner. Doesn't that sound good? Okay. You need to delegate and atomize this thing down, and so that way, not all the responsibility goes through one person. A lot of shops, especially like AMD, was in a situation where we started out as a very, very small company, and so we used to have it where an artist would get an image, and they would work on that model. They would do the lighting, they would do the materials, they would do the painting, and it would all go through that one person. And a lot of shops end up in this situation where they start to scale up and they still get in that same model. And that model is a disaster if you want people to be able to go home at a reasonable time. Like, it's a disaster. It's just not good. So you need to be able to atomize stuff so that way it doesn't all go through one person, or any too much of the process goes through one person. And last but not least, living on that asymptote. Trying not to disappoint clients. Right? You can come back to the project sometime in the future, or a week from now. And what can happen is that the junior artist can make some changes in that 3D file. It can get rendered, and then they can take over the PSD, and the senior artist doesn't have to do it. Okay? And you know that those little, we call it like the management phase of the image. It's a way to dress up how to lose money, but that's what we call it in the office. Like, how do you take that management phase of that image to be able to lose as little money on it as you possibly can and still keep the client happy? So those for us are what the ideal workflow would be, in my estimation. So, whoopsie. So this is the fundamental components of it. Fundamental components are you need to use XREFs. Everybody's familiar with the concept of XREF. Does anybody use them in 3D Studio? Yeah, some. Okay. Pass Manager. Does everybody use a Pass Manager? Does anybody use a Pass Manager? Okay. Non-destructive editing. So non-destructive editing. How many people use Photoshop for their final images? They use Photoshop. How many use After Effects for their final? Okay. Why do you use After Effects out of interest? What's that? Okay, just for the animation. Okay, yeah. Okay. It's handy, though, that it does non-destructive editing, though, right? That the passes just come right in. Isn't that a beautiful thing? Does everybody wish, how many times has people wished in their lives that Photoshop did the same thing? Like, that you could just bring in an image and it would just link back to a layer. Has everybody wished for that? Has everybody wished and prayed for that? Okay. And for God's sake, render at night. And everybody sounds like everybody renders at night. Okay. Okay. Software. We're going to use 3D Studio Max. We use RP Manager, V-Ray, and Backburner. I hate Backburner. I hate it. Anyway, I think, though, right now I'm going to take a little break. If we could take about a 5-minute break. Is that cool, Jeff? Is it cool to take a 5-minute break? Okay. So I'm going to deign to get into Max here a little bit. I'm not going to model anything, or I might model a couple boxes for you. But I think you probably know how to do that. We're going to talk about RP Manager. We're going to talk about V-Ray. Not really. We're not even going to talk about V-Ray. We'll have it as our render engine, but I'm not a good... You can ask me about shadow mapped spotlights in 3D Studio for DOS, but V-Ray, I'm lost. So V-Ray will be our render engine, but that's about it. But but we'll look at RP Manager. We'll look at our typical project setup. And then I think Gordon will have something for you right after lunch that will be worth every penny you spent coming to Boston. Okay? So you have something to look forward to. All righty? So be here on time for that. I know that's something coming from me. Okay. So, so basically, what we do here in the office is, in order to be able to start working on a project before we actually have any information, obviously we've gotten some information from the client in order to price the job, bid the job. So we generally know, like, okay, there's going to be 4 views, there's going to be 3 views. We know that some are going to be interior. We know one's going to be exterior. We generally know, they'll give us a Google Earth pin of where the project location is, so that way we can have an idea about, what cardinal north is or cardinal south is, and all those kinds of things. So we know, even if we don't have any of the specifics at that time, we know generally what the scope of the job is going to be, right? Everybody in the same boat, basically. You know what the scope of the job is going to be. You also generally know how many people you have. Sometimes you don't. Sometimes you're in a frantic search to find a couple more contractors to come in and do some work for you, but or hire some people. But generally, you know how many people you have, and generally you know what the scope is going to be. So even if you don't know the specifics, you know this kind of stuff. So what we do, the first thing that we really do is we set up our job directory. So what we're going to do is we are going to set up a job directory for all of our XREFs. And I had all of this ready to go. I could have just copied it over, but I just kind of want to show you guys the process here. And whoop, that's not what I meant. Okay, so I have a bunch of these directories. Max will automatically set up job directories for you. We kind of had already done this before they started adding that feature, so we kind of go with our own nomenclature. But basically, you have the job name up here, and then you have a meshes folder, and under meshes, you have XREFs, and then we're going to have a base version of our XREF. We're going to have an invisible version of some of our XREFs. We are going to have lighting XREFs, and we are going to have matte versions of the some of our base XREFs. Okay, XREFs are nothing fancier than max files. For those of you that aren't familiar with XREFs, they're max files. It's just that they are referenced in from another location. Max has been generally trying to push people towards containers in the last couple of releases. Unfortunately, RP Manager does not support containers, so right now we're using XREFs. So if we know, so these are kind of our job directory for our meshes files. And then we will do another under our job name. In this case, it's CGS School Demo. We'll do another folder, images. Spell it right. New folder. UO1. And then we do 2 folders. Nightly, and then we do current. Okay. So basically, what we do is, on a nightly basis, we are going to render our passes to the nightly folder here under the images. That's what happens on a nightly basis, and then in the morning, the senior artist will actually flip the names of these, and then bring all the passes in from the current folder. so you're never actually overwriting the previous night's stuff. So in case there's a total disaster, you have the stuff from the night before. Does that make sense to people? Okay. So and nightly is inspired from Hollywood dailies. It's basically what that's. More than one person has expressed to me, man, that's so confusing. But if you think about it as like Hollywood dailies versus the current cut of the picture, like that's kind of how we think about it. Anyway, so really the first thing we do is we set up our images and we set up our meshes folder. Now usually under most of our job folders we have other stuff as well, like correspondence in and then by date. We also have a custom maps folder that goes for that particular job drive. Most of our proxies are located on our server. They aren't part of the job per se. Okay. So anyway, but the job folder, the two workhorses of that job folder that you're going to be worried about in Max are that images and that meshes folder. Okay. So one thing that you might have noticed or might have heard talk about is kind of object-oriented programming. Everybody ever heard of object-oriented programming? Where they can take an entire computer program and what they do is they break it into discrete elements, and each discrete little piece of code ends up being something written by one person that then feeds a variable out to somebody else's little piece of code that then feeds that variable. And it's a way to break up these monster programs. Another thing that people may have noticed is that when they're working in an architecture office or they see an architecture set sheet, more than once, we've seen the set sheet where there are all these interior elevations that are spec'd out in the plan. Like you see that diagram of kind of the diamond with the circle in the middle of it, and then you have the name of the drawing pointing to that elevation. And then we say, hey, it would be great if you could get us that elevation, right? And they say, oh, yeah, we haven't gotten there yet, right? The lesson, though, there is this, is that if you break up an entire set of stuff before you've even laid eyes on it and started to organize it before you've even laid eyes on it, you know what you have to get through. Okay? You know what you have to get through. So the first thing that you should be doing is taking a look at what is my staff, what is my scope. If I have one guy for 4 weeks, basically, I can minimize the number of 3D files that I have to make, the number of XREFs that I have to make, because that guy can work on it consistently, and I don't have to break it up. If I have 3 renderings of a huge complex due in 3 days, I'm going to need to staff it with 10 people, and all of a sudden, I need to break up my files in such a way that the number of XREFs I have is make sure that every single person that's on that team is going to be productive during those times. Okay? Even if you don't know what the curtain wall information is of that one building that's in the back. Even if you don't know what the plaza design is going to look like, you know how many people you have, and you know all the stuff that you need to get through, right? In a general sense. Is everybody with me on that? Okay. So basically, what we're going to be doing this afternoon, Gordon's going to be working on one little atrium image that we did for a project. In that particular case, we were working on that project, and I think we had like 8 views, and we had probably 4 people working on it, and it was due in like 3 weeks or a month or something like that. And so basically, it was kind of generally like our jobs are in that range. Okay. Sometimes they're faster, sometimes they're slower. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to let's just set it up in the abstract. So we do file, and I'm not going to have anything in this file. All right. Save as. Save as. And I'm going to call it I cannot see my keyboard. Can anybody else? Okay. So I've now saved off a file called Atrium Base Max. It's not really that. Everybody excited about that? Okay. All right. As part of this job, As part of this job, we also are doing a library. We also are doing a gym. We're also doing a lobby. Okay. So I'm going to come in here, and I'm going to set those up. This is the equivalent, of course, of that program being broken down into its component pieces, right? This is the equivalent of that architectural project saying, all right, I need to worry about this elevation, I need to worry about this elevation, I need to worry about this elevation. I'm going to title all of these drawings that I have to get through by the time I finish. But right now, in the very early on, I'm just going to lay out all of those different pieces so that way people have that territory that they then need to fill in. Okay? So you've already projected out, these are all the stuff that I need to fill out, so nobody's wondering, and then we can actually get started before we've gotten any information from the client. You can actually start thinking about how to organize this thing. All right, so atrium, gym, lobby, library. Copy. Paste. Rename. I'm going to do a glass pass, or glass XREF. Okay. Probably going to need to do a site. Oopsie. Probably going to need to do, oopsie. Sorry. Furniture. Let's do and so on and so on. Does everybody see where I'm going here? Like you're setting out the scope of files that need to be fleshed in by your team before the end of this project is over. Okay? This number, if you had one guy for 6 weeks working on it, you could reduce this number. If you have 10 guys for 3 days, you have to increase that number. Basically, you're trying to make sure that not all of this falls, that more than 8 hours of work a day, or 9 hours, or as my wife points out, 10 hours of work a day is totally accomplishable by these people. All right, so we're going to do all those in the base one. Copy. Gordon, what other XREF should I add here? We can do that, yeah. Oh, rats. That's not what I meant to do. Okay. And we probably are going to have some plantings in the lobby. And we're probably going to have some site plantings. Okay. So now we're going to take all these, copy them, invisible, paste, and copy them into here. All right. We're going to need an invisible version of the base. Now, basically what invisible versions of stuff are for is stuff that you're going to see reflected that you don't necessarily want to be cut out of the mask. So we are going to do some object passes of stuff if we need to. So for instance, on exterior shots, typically you're going to do object passes of like, does everybody know what an object pass is? Does anybody not know what an object pass is? Okay, so we're going to end up doing object passes of like cars and trees. Basically the things that are the most subjective that the client's going to react to, we want to pull those render passes out separate than the main render passes, just because we know that generally speaking, we want our senior artist to be able to remove them without necessarily affecting the rest of the image, right? Because we know that we have the most leverage in post. Okay, so that's one reason why we have object passes. Another reason why we have object passes is because those are the types of things that the client usually reacts to most strongly, especially if you're dealing with more kind of like developer side clients. They're going to react to those things more strongly. Like, oh my God, like, why are you showing a 1987 Mercedes-Benz? Like, you're crazy, you know? Like, so we need to be able to make sure that those are separated out. So, so basically, we're going to set up object passes for some things, and we don't necessarily, and we want passes for specifically the reason why, the main reason why you want invisible versions of things is so you have reflections of stuff in glass that isn't cutting the masks out of glass. So for instance, if you set up an object pass for your glass is notorious, right? It's notorious. Like your client is going to, your client always has comments about the glass. Has anybody ever had a client that didn't have comments about the glass? Right? So your client, so you really want, you absolutely want to do your glass as a separate pass. And so if you're doing your glass as a separate pass and you have your trees on that you're trying to reflect, even if you have a matte version of those trees, guess what? They're cut out of the glass then. And it makes it a lot harder for your senior artist to be able to manage that glass appropriately, right? Does everybody understand the logic of that? Okay. So so right now what we do is that we have invisible versions of things that we might want to have reflected in glass, and that's really why you do it. You know, so, but other than that, you don't really need the invisible versions of stuff. So atrium base is going to be all of the stuff that's in the atrium that isn't glass. Basically, anything that's matte material. I shouldn't use the word matte, but anything that isn't a glass or isn't a highly reflective material. Okay, or I should say glass or mirror. Same with gym, same with base, same with library furniture. We're going to probably put that in the base rendering. Okay, we probably want that to be invisible. We probably want to have an invisible version of that. Okay, so the only two things that we really want to have invisible versions of are going to be the lobby plantings and the site plantings. So we're going to just change this. And the reason why I'm naming them these is because we have we developed an in-house script that's going to be sensitive to these kinds of namings. So just so you know. Okay, so XREF. So now we're going to come into our matte version. We're going to paste these. Now we don't need the glass to be matte. We don't need any glass passes to be matte. And everybody knows why you make matte versions of things? Yes? No? Does anybody not know why you make matte versions of things? What's that? Matte versions? Does everybody's done, like, everybody's made matte versions of their stuff in order to isolate other elements? Okay. Whoops. So these matte versions will basically allow us to isolate our glass. So when we set up our glass passes, we'll use the matte versions of these things to be able to be reflected in the glass, but they won't be present there in the alpha. Yeah. Yeah.
The risk of sound. So the difference that you're talking about is about transparency, or is it about reflection? I mean, what's the when you have a matte one, is because you may have a matte object, a solid object that has no transparency, but it may have some reflection, right? And it will reflect the trees and the cars from the 80s, right? So it's the idea. I'm trying to understand the workflow that you're describing.
Yeah.
You have your building, and then you have your glass, and then you have a tree and a car. The client doesn't like the car. You change the car. You have to re-render that pass. You have to re-render the glass probably to show that reflection, I suppose. Is that the reasoning behind how you're breaking?
The reason why you're breaking it down right now is so that way you can start working before the client's gotten you any information. Like that's the main thing. Now, fundamentally, let's take a look at some of the passes that we're looking for in the end. So generally, we render glass just as a mirror. No, very rarely is architectural illustration radically affected whether you get the index of refraction right on an eighth of an inch pane of glass, right? So basically what you're doing is glass is always just a product of what's behind it and then what it's reflecting. And so if you have those two components separately, say for instance you have the, so let's take a look at, why am I not seeing the base, Gordon? Okay, so there it is. Okay. Oh, great. Yeah, let's see what it does. Yeah, you'll bother Nils. That's not what I wanted. Let's take a look at where we're trying to go. That's an excellent question. Thank you. I should have. Where we're trying to go is we're trying to get all of these passes. Those are the later ones. Okay. Current. So we're trying to get to all of these passes. Say, for instance, for this atrium space that we're doing. So that's a base pass. That's pretty darn ugly, isn't it? Right? I mean, that's if that's coming out of your box and you're presenting that to the client, they're going, oh my god. All right. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to come out the other side with all of these passes. So this is a typical base pass that we have right here. Okay. This is our typical glass pass. Okay. So what we did, the way this glass pass is made is it's basically the glass is just a mirror. The glass is just set up as a mirror material. There's no refraction on it at all. All right. And then we have a matte version of the atrium base that's basically separating out, so that way we only get the glass in it. Does everybody see what that is? Is that clear? So that's like just one of the passes that fundamentally we're trying to get out the other side, and then we'll take this in and let's see if it has an alpha. It doesn't have an alpha, but like so. Let's bring it in. Put that one on screen. So what? Come on. take that one. Obviously, it overlays on top of, right? So that's what we're trying to do. And you can control the opacity of this one then in post. So your client, if your client says, I want the glass more transparent, you can make it more transparent. If you want it, more opaque, you can make it more opaque. I got a lot of puzzled looks out there, and I just want to make sure that that people understand kind of, it'll become clear this afternoon when Gordon starts to weigh into it. And starts talking about Photoshop proper. But that's fundamentally on the other side of this. That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to get stuff separated out that we know is always very sensitive subjects for the client to be able to talk about. Whether that's glass or whether that's entourage or whether that's glass, entourage, materials, blah, blah, blah. We're trying to just make sure that whatever we have on the opposite side of this here retains as flexible as possible. If we built in the refraction in here, if we built the refraction in there, then you don't really give yourself any options as the guy compositing, right? We're not looking for a complete 3D solution. There is no one answer to this piece of architecture. Mind passing that mic back there?
I mean, essentially, you could set up glass, but just raw reflection and refraction would give you the same flexibility, right?
It would. You wouldn't get an AO pass back there, for instance.
Okay.
So you could,
like an AO pass behind the glass.
Like an AO pass behind the glass.
Yeah. Okay.
So so we just try and keep it as flexible as we can keep it. And some of this, honestly, like we periodically are in a situation where, we know that we're using workflows we know that we're using some kind of biased workflows towards how we used to do it, and we consistently are kind of evaluating. And as a matter of fact, we just did an animation project where we did it precisely that way. It's like, we don't have time to render all these different passes. We just need to push all of the geometry through in one fell swoop, and we need to render the refraction and the reflection pass separately. The problem is that once we were looking from the outside in, we couldn't get our furniture to really sit like we wanted it to sit. You know what I mean? But you definitely can do it that way. You definitely can do it that way. Okay. Is that helpful? Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay. All right, so we're trying to get out all of this different kind of stuff. We're trying to get out alpha masks right here. We're trying to, we have cars because we set up cars for this shot, but that was because we didn't know really what was going to be composed in that shot when we started the RP Manager file, right? We want glass. We want a bunch of multi-material. We want a bunch of multi-matte masks here. So we have A, B, C, D, E, F, G. We want some, planting passes. We had something set up for a people pass. So if we wanted to use some 3D people or people sticks, we could do that. The real workhorses are right here as the base pass, the GI pass, and the lights on pass. And those Gordon is going to kind of be looking into. But very often we'll do a raw lights. We'll do, especially for like planting passes, we'll do a raw light pass as well, just to kind of enhance those. You can always add those, and we are consistently, you're consistently evaluating, and that's part of the job of the senior artist, is to take that first set of passes that are being generated by the 3D and then push back on the project manager and push back on the junior artist and say, I need this pass, I need that raw light pass, I need a matte shadow pass, I need a Z-depth pass. And that's part of the job of the senior artist, to be able to say, like, I really need these aspects to start to leverage this forward. Like another one, Z-depth. Like if you render the glass as part of it, you don't get any Z-depth, and that's an issue. So anyway, so as many different tools as the senior artist needs. Like my job as the project manager is to give as many tools to the senior artist as they need to be able to make the image that they and hopefully the client want. Okay. So back to this. All right. Bear with me. Hopefully it will become clear. Okay. So now I have this file. I have all these other, let me see if I've renamed all those. Meshes, XREFs, matte versions. Okay. So these I renamed. these are ostensibly the XREFs that I need to get through during the course of this project. These are the XREFs that I identify that I absolutely need to get through. Okay. Again, it's trying to take some of the workflows of like object-oriented programming, trying to get some of the workflows like we see in architecture offices, setting up drawing sets and applying them to our industry. So it doesn't all have to go through one artist or a very small selection of artists. Trying to break it down. Okay, so XREF lighting, paste. All right, so now what I'm going to do here, so I'm going to do sun U01, and I'm just going to do atrium lighting. I don't think that's a question. Is that a question, Mohammed? All right. Hopefully he will. At some point. Okay, so now we have all of these XREFs. Does everyone, there's nothing in those XREFs. Everybody knows that, right? Does everybody understand that they're there, though, for junior artists then to start filling? Okay, that's why he did them. All right, so now what we're going to do is we're going to come back to Max. And close that one down. And here in Max, what we're going to do is we're going to load up this Max script. I think that there's we made some minor modifications to it, but it's basically on script spot, and that is it's a load XREFs. It's a load XREFs script. If I knew anything about any of this stuff, I would explain it. But so what we do is you find the directory you want to load into, you load from. So we're going to come into here and do CGS demo. Before I do that, I'm going to close RP Manager down. All right. Control E. I'm going to come in here. Local disk. So these are all of my XREFs that I want to load in. Okay. Base. I want to load in my invisible ones. That next. All. Go. I want to load in all of my maths next. All. Go. Lighting. Okay. So now when I come in over here and I look at my references, see that I have all these XREFs already loaded into the scene, and none of them are enabled. Okay, none of them are enabled. All right. So, but what I want to do is now I want to start. What I'm going to start to do, even before I want to emphasize, this is to even out your workflows. We are starting now to set up our render passes before we've gotten any information at all. Okay? This is evening out the workflow. So instead of sitting there waiting for 2 days for the guys to get you the design information, you've actually already determined what files you need to set out, and now you're going to start setting up your render passes. So that way you can have those, basically, and they will flow into your RP Manager file. And then your RP Manager file will spit out the passes, to your render farm. You will render them, and they will go into your images directory. Okay? Does that make sense to everybody? Like, we're not waiting for stuff. We used to use this RP Manager program. Here this is. This is a render pass manager for those that haven't used one before. So basically, you set up these passes over here. You know, they sell it like it's a Hollywood deal, and you know, you can set up visibility sets in your file, and you can turn stuff on and turn stuff off, and you can tie it into scene states and all that kind of good stuff. Fundamentally, if the geometry isn't into the file, though, you know, which is what you're really waiting for, because as we all know, our workflow is very much dependent on clients getting us notes and changing geometry. If you are waiting on them getting you notes and then you're changing geometry, you cannot walk out of the office at the end of the day, because you're still waiting for your modelers to be able to make those changes, so that way you can say in that visibility set, I want you to turn that off, you know, in this visibility set over here. Like, let me just do a quick camera here. Create V-Ray. Sorry, I think I'd used this before. All right, create V-Ray. So now, what I can do is I can add a pass. So it's automatically, we don't worry about most of this stuff. We don't really worry about most of this stuff. You know, you can get into it. Like, here's all your render engine stuff. Like, right now I think it's set at default scan line, which is not so good. Change it to V-Ray. All your V-Ray stuff is right here. It's a little bit different looking than you're used to in your V-Ray settings, but all your stuff is there. And what you do is you're coming up here, and let's just, this is the common parameters of this are, we're going to tell it what resolution we're going to go to. Generally, we render about 4,000. Sometimes we'll render more, but that's really pretty much the standard for us. We do 4,096. We come over here, we're going to say, we're going to look for where we're going to save this file. U1 nightly, and we do OpenEXRs for our stuff. I'm not going to worry about gamma or V-Ray settings or anything like that. All of those are totally customizable to whatever your workflow is. For the sake of disclosure, we usually run 2.2 gamma. We do OpenEXRs. For most of our masks, we end up doing JPEGs, believe it or not, and just turning it up, you know, as far as the anti-alias thing goes. Okay, so rename. And now we're going to go call this Atrium base. So this is our first pass in this Atrium base. And we're going to be using, if we come down here, you can take a look, you can see it, we're going to be using this camera, the V-Ray 1 camera, right? And now we need to enable some XREFs. So we're going to control XREFs. We need to enable our Atrium base file. I'm a little concerned about the color. Can everybody read this? Is everybody able to read this? Okay. So, so for the Atrium base, we're going to enable that file. We're going to enable the Sun file. Right? And what else do we need to enable? We need to enable any kind of furniture. Let's say the atrium and the lobby are shared. They're right next to each other, okay? So we're going to enable these two as well, okay? So basically, for this particular pass, what we're doing is we're coming through here and enabling these guys, right? And we know we're going to get the sun, okay? Does that make sense to everybody? Is that a lot like scene states, except that you can do it as the absolute first thing as opposed to the absolute, like in the middle of the project after you've gotten stuff? Does that make sense to people? Why you would want to do it now as opposed to later on? Right? Okay. So basically you're going to come through here. So the workhorses, like I said, are the base file. We're going to do the GI pass, which is not really a GI pass. It's actually a skylight pass. So what we do for that is we're going to turn the sun off, and we're just going to be let it lit with skylight. As a matter of fact, what we need to do, there are a few items that appear in the RP Manager file. One is cameras. You need to set all your cameras up in your RP Manager file. This file will have no geometry in it. No geometry in it. Okay? Everything, there are exceptions to that, but they may have been fixed in V-Ray 3.0. And I should say it because it'll drive you absolutely bonkers if you don't know it. If you use a V-Ray light material that does direct lighting, if you bring it in as an XREF, it is a known bug to absolutely crash your machines. Okay? So if you do a V-Ray light material that's using direct light, again, regular V-Ray light materials, they're absolutely fine. But if you click on that direct light button, it will crash your machines when you try and render it. Hopefully you don't have a project due the next day. So, but anyway, so just a heads up. So, so in those kinds of situations, you will probably want to just bring in that geometry and figure out and just have that layer hidden for your renders. If you need to do that. If you don't need to do it though, you're better off. Is that helpful? Just so everybody knows. Okay, so we're setting up the GI pass now. What we're going to do, we're going to do a light. Because the other thing that's going to appear in your RP Manager file is usually your sun. Because you need to set up an environment light. Okay. Stay with me, folks. Think about it, getting out of the office at 5:30 in the afternoon. Think about that. When we're going through this, realize this is all in an effort to get you guys out at 5:30, all right? Okay, good. Okay, so we have this light. We're going to set up that as we can actually come back up here. Render setup. For the base pass, I actually usually just actually let in the common parameters here, I actually just let the, oh, please, 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 please. Okay. That's all right. We're not using force pack. Jeff? Yeah, I don't know what that looks like. Dear Autodesk. I'm pen pals with them. I don't know if you knew that. Okay. Yeah. All right. That's okay, because honestly, everything's XREF. Right? Everything's XREF. So the only thing we need to repeat is we need to bring the XREFs in, and we need to start the RP Manager over. I'm not, I don't think, going to... What's that? Oh, yeah. By the time I get to Phoenix... Okay. So first thing, we're going to bring back those XREFs in. Okay. So we brought all those XREFs in, and now we're going to go back into, we'll make the camera this time, and we'll actually set up the environment light first, so I don't have to try and open the material editor and crash the machine. Hopefully that will work. Okay. So make my camera. I'm going to go ahead and do a V-Ray Sun. Okay. So now when I click on RP Manager, it's going to say, do you want to? Yes, I do. And that will hopefully get me my V-Ray Sky into my environment slot, so I don't have to open up the material editor. The demo will be more difficult without a material editor because there are some handy things in RP Manager that I will show you. But I think you're just going to have to do it conceptually, make the leap, just because it looks like if I'm opening the material editor, it's just going to crash the machine. Shouldn't be very complex, though. Okay. And I think once I show you the button, you'll be like, oh my God, that would be very useful. So I think that we'll be okay. Alrighty. So production setup, we're not going to change. We're going to change that to Atrium base. We're going to change where we're going to. We're going to go to the View 1 Nightly, and we're calling it View 01 base. We got to come up with other names than base, I know, but it's what you'll find over the years is that we end up, there's a lot of cross-pollination of shops, and so your nomenclature ends up being the same as other shops. So anyway, so base pass. Base pass, which we think at the initial stages, we think is going to be the major pass that we're going to use for most of the tones and colors that we're using in this. We think that's going to be composed of our Atrium base. We think we're going to have to turn on our lobby base because it's next to it. We have to turn on our lobby furniture. We're going to leave the plantings off. We are going to see outside to our site, so we need to turn that one on. We need to turn on our sun, and we are going to just enable all of those. Okay. So now, what will happen on this particular pass? What's going to happen is it's going to call this sun file. It's going to call that site file. It's going to call these lobby furniture and base file. It's going to call the Atrium base file, and it's going to render all of those together, right? And then it's going to save it out as View 1 base, EXR. Okay, easy peasy, right? Does that make sense? Everybody with me? Okay. So now what we're going to do another one. This one's going to be base GI. Again, it's not really a GI. It's a skylight. So what on this one we're going to do is we are going to it's all Mac script, so you can't really cut and paste, unfortunately. But we'll leave that in place for now. So base GI, the only difference between base and base GI is that we're going to turn off our sun. Okay. I should also say what we're going to do here. We have this font. We have the sun. I'm going to save that. Save selected. I should have done this initially. Okay. Save demo meshes XREF lighting sun view 1 max. Okay. Did I do save selected? I didn't. Cancel. File. Save as. Save selected. Yes. Okay. And now I can turn this off. So basically, I have an XREF sun file that I'm going to bring in for my actual direct light. But this sun in the RP Manager file, I'm going to leave off. And the only thing that this sun is doing right now is it's allowing me to set up that V-Ray Sky. And it's the key for the V-Ray Sky. Is that kosher? You'd be like, why didn't he do it? There may be a better way to do it. We went through months trying to figure out the best way to do this. This is what we came up with. So if anybody has an idea, tell me. But I think that this is fundamentally what we came to, is that you let one sun that's turned off in the RP Manager file, you let that one do the work of the V-Ray sky, and then you bring in the other one to actually do the direct light. Okay. So anyway, so base GI, the only difference between base and base GI is that I'm turning off my sun. Why do you do that? Does anybody know why I would do that? No? Does anybody have a good idea why I would do that? So you can paint shadows. That's it. Paint shadows. You don't have to do blue. You don't have to do curves. Just paint shadows. The only difference between the sunlight shot and the GI shot is basically the direct light. So if you want people shadows, it's so much cleaner to do a skylight pass of your project. Okay. Another one. We're going to do lights on. Okay, so lights on. So what I'm going to do, that one I'm going to turn on my atrium lights, atrium lighting. Okay, I'm going to turn off the sun. I am also going to turn off my V-Ray sky. And my background is going to be black. So what that's going to do, what that pass is going to do, we don't really have a good version of it right now. Gordon will show you a good version of it. But if you are trying to build a tension between the light that's coming down through the middle of the atrium and then the lights that are happening in the room behind it, and you're trying to balance those out, you can spend an absolute eternity doing that in 3D. An absolute eternity. If, however, you break it down to where you have a lights on pass that's basically all the mechanical lights that are in that space behind you, and then you have the natural light coming in, then you can, in Photoshop, start to break those down and be able to balance those a lot more easily. Okay? That's why you do it. So this pass is, we want to make sure that there's no skylight that's contributing to this pass. Right? So we've turned that off. The only light that's contributing to this pass is actually the lights that are in the XREF, in the atrium lighting XREF. Again, everybody realizes there's nothing in any of these files yet, right? We are only just conceptually setting up how we know, how we're giving the tools to our senior artists to be able to manage these things as quickly as possible in 2D and balance elements out that we know are going to be sore spots or hot spots with our client. Okay. And give them the most amount of leverage to make something great. Okay. So let's do glass. Atrium. Glass. You know what I forgot to do? And any rookie would have said that. Okay, so I need to go back and change what I'm calling these things. So atrium base is called view 1 base. View 1 base GI is called base GI. I need to make sure this is called lights on. Hello. Atrium glass. We're going to call this one view 1 glass. So this one is a little bit different, right? So this one, we don't really want our base version of our atrium XREF. We don't really want that. So we're going to turn that one off. But what we're going to come down, and same with the version of this, same with the version of this, right? And we don't really want our site. And probably, just the way it's set up right now, all the lights are behind the glass in this scene. Right? All the interior, all the mechanical lights are behind the glass in this scene. So guess what? They're not going to have any contribution really to the fronts of the glass. Really, like as far as the visual aspect. So those lights in the rooms beyond the glass, like when we render our glass, we render it as a mirror. And because we render it as a mirror, it's going to reflect what's behind us, and we don't really have any lights over there. We know we're not going to have any lights over there, so we can actually just turn that one off as well. Sometimes, though, you will need mechanical lights, but in this particular case, we know from our scene, all of our lights are really going to be back here, in those rooms beyond. So they're not really going to contribute to the fronts of our glass or any of the objects that are really on the front of our glass. I mean, you can make the argument that it'll contribute here, contribute there. If you want to make that argument, be my guest. Fundamentally, though, as far as impact to the image, it's not, especially if this is a daytime shot, the amount of light that these things are going to be contributing forward of that glass is absolutely minimal. So you can really just turn it off. Okay, so atrium glass. So what XREF do we want to enable for atrium glass? We actually want to turn on the atrium-based glass. So that one we absolutely positively need. We know that the lobby is next door, so we need to turn that one on as well. So that's the version of these things that's basically totally unadulterated. There's nothing fancy about those objects. They're just glass, and they're just mirrors, okay? But what we want to do in order to get a clean alpha, get these things to pop in, is we want to have our matte version of our atrium. We want to have a matte version of our lobby, and we want to have a matte version of our furniture lobby. Lobby and the furniture, I mean. Okay? And we want to have sun. Because that we still believe that our major pass that we're working here that's going to give us the most amount of tones to our final piece is probably our base pass with the sun coming down. We may decide later on that that's not right. We may decide later on that fundamentally this is going to work better as an evening shot. If it works better as an evening shot, then really realistically, we probably want to switch these up. We want to say to ourselves, really, the interior lighting is going to contribute a lot more tones to the final scene, so we really want to enable that one as opposed to the sun. But for the first pass of this thing, we're going to try doing it this way. Okay. Common parameters. All right. So now we're going to take this guy. All right. And we're going to copy him. We're going to move him down. Masks. So one thing you'll notice here is that we didn't set this thing up to do any elements at all in our EXR file. We tend not to put any one pass. Obviously, you see, we're trying to break any image down that we have into a bunch of different passes. We try not to do too much on any one given thing. Like you could conceivably try and do this all in 3D and do the lighting on the interior and do the sun on the outside and do the index of refraction on the glass. And then you can sit there and wait and render and wait for it to render for 5 hours. Right? Or you can break it up this way. That allows your senior artist to be able to work it over in 2D, and everything's going to be done in about 45 minutes. That's a huge difference. That's a huge difference. If you have to render at lunch, that's an enormous difference. Okay. So anyway, so atrium-based masks. One of the things we've noticed over the years is that anti-aliasing. If you use some of the V-Ray anti-aliasing, like and please nobody raise their hand and tell me you don't know what you're talking about, because I'm going to admit right now I don't know what I'm talking about. The anti-aliasing on your masks, especially on your multi-mats, are nowhere near as good if you're using some of the sampling from the. Good Lord, Gordon, can you tell me what I'm talking about? So, if we're using render setup. We're still at default scan line. Great. Okay, so no wonder I don't have any of those samples. Okay, so we're going to take all these. I'm going to change them to V-Ray. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So if I go in here and do if I do one of these guys, inevitably they key into your RGB values. If you're doing some sort of some advanced sampling, they key into your RGB values. They don't necessarily give you great anti-aliasing on your masks. That's what we've noticed. I may be wrong, but that's what we noticed, especially with maybe it was 1.5. We haven't changed it subsequently. So we actually render a separate pass just for masks. So if I come over here, I'm going to come over here to elements, and I'm going to add elements. So maybe that was overkill. Maybe I don't need to do that to you guys. Yeah, I don't need to do that to you guys. Sorry. That's generally we've set up about 15 multi-mats, but I don't need to drive you guys nuts with that. All right, we'll do 3 of them. So atrium base masks. So what I want for that one is I still want my atrium base. I don't need my sun though. I certainly don't need to set up indirects at all, right? I don't need to set up any of that stuff. What I do probably want to do though is I need to come in here and I need to change my anti-alias thing. And I'm an old school guy. I just like fixed. It's just like just don't even. Anyway, so I just set it up at fixed usually for the masks. For these other stuff, I'm fully down with changing it up. Anyway, so come in here to this base mask, and this is where you kind of set up some of your elements. So what we can do here is we can add Z depth. We can add. We do a lot of multi mats. Do alpha, obviously. And then really it kind of just varies like based on what we need. You know, like sometimes we need to refract because we want to be able to do that. And say for instance you have like a bunch of layers of glass that you need to see through, then we start to move to a physical glass as opposed to just a mirror glass, just to make life a little bit easier and reduce the number of passes that people have to deal with. So it's like there is some give and take on this thing. You can't figure everything out before you've seen the project, but you can make a whole heck of a lot of progress on a project before you've seen anything. Okay. So anyway, so this is a multi-mat element. Everybody has done object IDs. Has everybody done material IDs? Does everybody do object IDs? Does anybody not do object IDs? Okay, so I don't need to talk about it at all? Okay. So basically multi-mat element, I'm going to come in here, refer to 1, 2, 3. I'm going to save off my save it off to view one nightly, and it's going to be 1-MMA, and I'm just going to make it a JPEG. Okay. I know, I fought like crazy not to do JPEGs. Finally, I was won over. B. Come in here. I'm going to change this to 4, 5, 6. Okay. That to C. 7, 8, 9. Okay. A. We'll just leave it like that for the time being. 1 underscore A. Okay. So basically, I've set up those masks for that. Okay. Atrium glass. We do run for the glass pass just because usually it's somewhat transparent. We do usually just render the masks with that. So what we'll do with that one is we'll do V-Ray alpha. That's alpha. Get variation in the glass, which is not really relevant in this particular situation, but we'll just do it for kicks. Material ID 1, 2, 3. Everybody does material IDs too. Yeah. Okay. Need to explain that. Okay. So so basically now this is the kind of start of a project file. So let's open this up a little bit more. Give you guys a little bit more real estate to look at. Okay. Come on, man. Yeah, I'm going to save it right now. Yeah, I know. Sorry. This is V-Ray 3, Max 2014, and it's not, there's some penalty to be paid for being at the very edge like that. Okay. File name, this is RPM shell 01. Nice. Okay. I'm getting nervous here. I mean, this really should be. I don't know if it's just a display or what. Everybody see why I'm nervous? Okay, all right. Yeah, I'm going to restart right here in a second. You'll notice these RP Manager files are tiny, right? Not carrying any geometry. $5:30. Think about it. I saw a sunset the other day going home. How impressive is that? It was before the time change. It was before the time change. My main project manager walks out almost without exception at 6 o'clock every day. All right. So, file. Okay. Anyway. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to come over here and I'm going to do Atrium. I'll do the AO pass. Again, we could set it up as an element into the base pass itself, but either it's an old habit or we just like it cleaner. So Atrium AO. So this is the AO pass. We're going to come over here to render setup. We can do it this way. We can do the traditional material override, right? We can do it that way. Here's a beautiful thing, though. And it's not something that I would use for the AO, but I'm working around a little bit because if I know right now, if I open my material editor, it's going to crash this, and I don't really want to do that to everybody. So I just want I want to point everybody to this button because it has some real upsides. So if I come over to my XREFs, what I can do is I can come over here to Atrium Base. I can actually, on a per XREF basis, change what material I'm using. Does everybody see that? So, for instance, if you want a matte shadow material on something, because right now we have a matte, and we have an invisible, and we have a regular just version of these things. If I wanted, though, to, say, for instance, I wanted the shadows of trees underneath of them, what I would do is I would take my site XREF, and I would do an alternate material under that one where it would receive shadows and contribute light and contribute alpha masks, and it would get shadows, but it actually, other than where the shadows are, it wouldn't give you an alpha. And then you could use that as a mask for your GI pass, for your skylight pass, and get the shadows underneath the trees. But if the client didn't like the trees, or your senior artist wanted to remove the tree, it's right out of there. Okay? Same thing with the cars. Right? Alternate material per XREF. Per XREF. So it's not per pass, it's per XREF. Very handy. Serious possibilities. I can't show it to you just because it'll crash the machine, but it's but that's not the case in 2013. That's not the case in 2012. And it looked like it was a forest pack problem, so presumably it wouldn't in 2014 either. Anyway, so we kind of go through here. We're going to set up an AO pass, and that one we would generally do that one just as an override, as per the V-Ray normal, and we would just do. We have masks, we have the glass, we have the lights on. These are kind of the main passes that we run. Sometimes we'll do a wireframe pass just to touch up the edges a little bit. The way you access that is you come in and so atrium wire, and your atmosphere is V-Ray tune, and then you're going to go in and you'll do and you would just do an override of just a white V-Ray material. Again, I apologize, I can't call up the material editor. That's a problem. But so you would do all those. Let's see. Let's come over here. And one wire. Okay, so we have all these passes. You can add more. We routinely will run a couple different AO passes based and change the diameter of what the sample of, or the diameter of the fall off for that V-Ray dirt material. Wire pass, but those are really kind of the main ones. I think we should do this glass one. I forgot to turn on one XREF, and that is XREFs here. We should come in and we should do invisible lobby plantings, invisible. So the lobby plants then will end up showing reflections in the glass, but they won't actually be as part of the alpha, nor will they subtract from the alpha. So if they overlap the glass, you'll still have glass behind them, which is kind of handy. Okay, so go here and we're going to do our prefix. We're going to do CGS demo. Eminence front. All right. Let's go. CG school demo. Okay, so now we're going to do, and we just are going to go ahead and we're going to click on alerts, atrium base, and atrium base mask. Okay, they have the same name as the output. We actually don't need this at all. So I'm just going to title it trash. I'm going to change it to JPEG. basically just so I don't get an error message. Okay. So what I just did there was I just clicked on alerts because it's gonna flag for me if I have things that are named the same, like files that are being written that are named the same. It's gonna flag me for other things too. So what we're gonna come down here. I'm gonna select all these guys, and you would basically have a set of these for every view that you were doing, and you would be enabling different XREFs for each of those views, right? So for the gym base file, you would have the sun that you were using for the gym base. You would have the gym base. You would have probably the site and maybe some furniture, right? That was happening. And that's what you would enable for that pass. Anyway, so come down here. We're going to go to network. Oh, good. No. All right. So let's run. All right. Is anybody from Neoscape here? You think they'd like me to start running Manager on this machine right now? Probably not. You know what I could do? Let me see. What we're going to do here, this is a very important button right there, suspended. Okay, so this is where you set all your stuff up. Now this works. This particular render pass manager, the RP manager, will work with Deadline as well. If you prefer Deadline, I don't use Deadline myself. It's okay. Okay. I don't use Deadline myself, so I can't show you that, but it does work with. Okay. Okay. So ideally, this would be obviously in a networked environment, and everybody has at least a small render farm, I presume, in their shop. Yes. No. No. Yeah. Okay. So everybody basically has a small render farm in their shop. What you do then here is once you set up all of this information, you probably got something wrong. A lot of buttons here, I've had project managers who describe to me as it's like rendering with Excel. It's like rendering with Excel, and I'm like, yeah, it is, but you're out of here at 6, so I don't want to hear it. So, so basically, you take all these things, and then you submit them, and it's going to say all these things are suspended. Warning. You say, yeah, that's fine. You know what? Let me make sure that I have the right. All right, BOS-del-2-@-O. So, so now my manager, in this particular case, I just want to show you kind of manager and monitor. because we're going to kind of talk about what now the end game is and why your senior people now are going to be able to walk out of the door early. Okay, so what we do here is we're going to take all these things and we're going to submit them, but we're going to submit them to our network render, and we're going to submit them. Okay. Save this. Ah. Okay. So these are now my render passes, right? And they're all set there as being like the passes go. So now what I can do is I can just take a look at them in there, and I can activate them if I need to activate them. So, and the beautiful thing about this is that because you don't actually have any geometry, you have no geometry in the RP Manager file. Because you have no geometry in there, you can unsuspend those at any time that you want to unsuspend those from home or from wherever. You do not have to go back into Max and then submit the passes. 2 weeks from now, if those passes are still good, like you didn't have the senior artist pushing back on you about anti-aliasing or anything else like that, all you need to do is you need to update your XREF, you need to run it through a script that I'm about to show you here, and restart your passes. And they're going to go to the exact same place. Okay? So you don't ever have to open up RP Manager again if you don't want to. You're keeping your senior people out of Max at the end of the day if you possibly can. There's nothing worse than Max crashing on you at 5:30, 7:30, 10:30 at night, right? So if you can imagine these passes are nothing but calling XREFs from somewhere else. That's all that they are. You're basically building a bridge. If you go back to ay, caramba. You're basically building a bridge from here to here. That's what you're doing, right? So basically, what you're doing is you're saying that project, that RP Manager file, because it's an empty shell, because I'm using it with Backburner, all I really need to do is I need to make small little 3D changes into individual files. You don't have to open up the monster file that you're working with. You can have individual junior artists that are working with individual files make one small little tweak to a material, an object ID, make a small adaptation to a piece of geometry. Like once you break it down, like honestly, the tools these days are like you can make like you can make changes so quickly in Max if your files are small. And if your people know what they're doing, you know, those junior artists know what they're doing, you can make that 15-minute geometry change, run it through as an XREF, save it off as an XREF, and then just restart the pass, and the whole thing is there, right? And the turnkey, and the end of the day, project manager responsibilities become so turnkey as far as I don't have to open up anything, I don't have to send anything. I just need to go in, I need to pull up monitor, and I need to restart passes. You can do that from your phone, right? Okay. Let's take a look at a couple things that probably should mention. When we looked at this base pass, what we did with these elements here is usually we run a bunch of multi-mat elements. And you'll see that when Gordon pulls up the file later today. And probably in the neighborhood of usually we provide room for like 35 object IDs in order to be able to just adjust, like adjustment layers in Photoshop, right? Adjustment layers in Photoshop. So what those are dependent on, though, is your end people using object IDs for their objects that they're making. Everybody knows how to do it. We found the best way to do it really is that you give your junior artists, like you're allowed to use 1 through 12 and let them make the best determination of how those object IDs are then deployed in their scenes. Because your junior artists are the ones that are fundamentally making all of the XREFs, right? So you give them, you give each of them one, you give each of them some number to be able to do. We tried to do it at first where it was just like, these types of objects would be this number, this type of object would be that number. And it just, one of the things about this method is having run a shop for this long. This is our 21st year. The amount of energy that we've expended on trying to get people to follow layer standards and follow object naming standards. Has everybody been there? Yeah. Did I mention object names once? You're giving your junior artists also flexibility to model as fast as they know how to model. Give them the latitude to be able to model this thing out. And then the senior artist will take a look at the passes and say, hey, Josh, I really need an object ID on this. I need an object ID on this. So each junior artist is responsible, like it's their domain. Those XREFs are their domain. And you want to give them as much latitude and liberty to do what they need to do on those. I don't care. I gave up. I don't care what layer you put it on. I don't care. Like what does it matter? Like what does it matter? Ultimately, hopefully these pieces are so bite-sized anyway that anybody can kind of weigh in, can go into those XREFs and be able to adjust those without a problem. I don't care what layer you put on. You could call everything box 01 for all I care. I really don't. You think about how much time you've spent trying to tell your junior artists to use layers, to use object names, and think about how many times they actually, during the height of the production, they get to be able to do those things. And how much time, when they do those things, how much time does it actually take? And how much time does it really save you? Right? Like this way, you're giving them absolute liberty to do it the way they need to do it. And if it's an organizational piece of garbage, they're the ones that have to see it through. Like you're pushing it back on them and saying like, look, this wasn't so great, and then they're saying, well, and they learn soon enough that they need to keep it generally organized for their own standards. Because everybody builds it different. Everybody builds it different, right? So that's one of the other advantages of this system is that you're not really having to wade through. Like some senior artists are having to wade through because they'll end up getting models from junior artists to be able to do highfalutin materials or whatever. But generally, if you keep those XREFs bite-sized XREFs, then it's not really that. The huge issue is when you have those monster model files, right? That is just it's all one big file, and everything is box 01. That's when you end up wasting time just trying to sort through the organization of it all. But if you break it down as XREFs beforehand, keep them bite-sized, then those kinds of problems go away. They just go away. So that's another huge upside of this. The end game every day. So you send these you send these passes as a project manager. You probably got it wrong. You're gonna come back to this RP manager. The senior artist is gonna say, I want this pass, I want this pass, I want this pass. You're gonna have to come back through and adjust it. The idea though is that after 3 or 4 nights of rendering it, in the abstract at least, even if not all the geometry is there, all of the stuff about the passes themselves that show up in Photoshop are solid. So geometry can change. Like we looked at in all those examples, right? We went from the canyon to the mirror visual to the D-box to the Tom Schaller. It's the same image. What's really changed is the geometry, right? What's really changed is the geometry. And fundamentally, that's really what you're trying to do. You're trying to get this into a spot where, the senior artist can kind of still work with those passes and push them through. All right, so let's talk about the end game here on every day. Save this. File new. So every day, your junior artists are making a little bit more progress on their XREFs. They're making a little bit more progress on their XREFs. They're making a little bit more progress on their XREFs. You don't really want them working all night. You don't want them working all night, one, because you don't have enough time then to render everything. So that's an issue. You don't want them working all night because it's just a cruddy way to live. You don't want them working all night because they really need to be there in order to be able to address comments from your client. And you don't really want them showing up, with 2 hours of sleep and just absolutely exhausted, right? Most of us are not, again, getting paid for our genius. Most of us are getting paid because we are sitting there during the same business hours as our client, and they are asking us to do stuff for them. So if you have a bunch of people working late nights, and then you have nobody in the day to be able to pick up notes, you're going to be in a problem. It's going to be a problem. You're not going to have any time to render stuff overnight. Render times, I feel like, has anybody ever used Onyx Tree? Yeah. I feel like rendering is like Onyx Tree or like trying to find your wife in a big city. It's just like, and by find your wife, I mean, or your husband, no offense. You're always feeling like you could date somebody better. And so Onyx Tree is this eternal promise. If I just tweak this curve of this branch, I'm going to get it better. 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 Be very careful, because you can do the same exact thing with tweaking lights. You are much better off just setting a deadline for yourself at the end of the day. Say, I have this amount of work that I have to get through. I'm going to stop at 6:30, and I'm going to set up these lights. And then I'm going to render it, and I'm going to see what the hell I get in the morning. And then if I'm wrong, if I'm wildly wrong, then I need to go back and tweak it, and then I need to do it something, blah, blah, blah. If I'm just a little bit wrong, I can totally deal with that in Photoshop. It's just not worth it. So anyway, so render times. Basically, back to the render time. I feel like if you're there's all this emphasis, and another analogy I like to use is if you're running a delivery business, you can get a Ferrari and get there fast, or you can buy a fleet of vans. I mean, fundamentally, like when you're talking about buying machinery and you're talking about like really where your best resources are spent, you're finding a way to make your life sane. Honestly, I feel like render times, as long as they're not more than 2 hours, render times are your best friend. They are your best friend, because you can always say to the client, I gotta render it. You gotta stop. I gotta render it. Like I need tonight to render it. Like I don't understand the obsession, honestly, with trying to make sure that, I mean, it's like the shower. It's like the only place where there's relief sometimes, right? I mean, it's like, come on, like render times, you got to use them to your benefit. Like I'm not advocating telling the client to go pound sand. I'm going to do everything I possibly can to make sure my client is happy. I'm not being callous about it, but at the same time, like the only time you're going to get some sleep sometimes is you tell the client, like, look, I got to render it. I have this much time. Like, I got to render it. Anyway, so I think that's something to, I would definitely use that to my advantage if I could use it to my advantage. So anyway, let's go back to end game of every day. So every day, your junior artists are basically working away on the XREFs that they're trying to do. And generally, you want to give them like 8 to 9 hours of work a day. Right, that's generally what people work. Some people, people in their 20s though, they usually like to get in a little later, and they like to work a little later, right? Right? I mean, that's generally, I mean, not always. Whereas senior people like to get in a little earlier and usually get home a little earlier. I'm speaking generalities. I'm not saying that that's always everywhere, everybody. So ideally, your workflow is such that your senior people can just walk out the door and it can be turnkey for them. And your senior artists are working, what they're doing is they're getting all the passes that rendered overnight, and they're pulling them into the PSD first thing in the morning. They're hammering out the image, the painting. They're hammering that out. We're trying to get that off to the client, ideally late morning, lunchtime. We're trying to get that out to them. Because if then the client has something that just like, oh my God, they can get back to us immediately, and then we can start to work on that 3D stuff for the afternoon and then get that into the next night's renders. And one of the things that we do very early on with the client is like, look, this is our schedule. Our schedule is we render overnight. Artists come in the morning. They bang out an image. We try and get it to you midday. If you don't get us notes immediately, we will not address those notes until the next day. And that means that you won't see the updates for 2 days. We are very happy to get you updates as soon as we can, almost on a daily basis. But some of the responsibility falls to you to be able to get those notes out. We will have internal notes. We will keep moving the ball forward. However, if you want your notes reflected or you see something that's going terribly awry, let us know immediately so that way we can start to address it for the next day's iteration. Right? So that's something that's something to be wary of on the schedule. Is like in the mornings, we're putting together images, we're assembling internal notes, we're getting it off to the client midday, and then in the afternoon we're working on the 3D notes again that are coming back, and then we're rendering it and we're starting it all over again. Okay. That's an excellent question. We were talking about it there, right?
Yeah,
like,
I was just speaking about
the question is like, how does it end? Have you ever met a client? Let me ask everybody. Has everybody ever met a client that if they didn't have more time in their schedule, that they didn't give you comments? Has anybody ever encountered a client that whose calendar had open time between when they gave you final comments and when they needed their images? That makes sense. There is no such thing as being done. There's no such thing. There's just not. Like we were talking about, Leonardo da Vinci carried around the Mona Lisa with him for years, making little tweaks there and there. There's no such. I shouldn't say there's no such thing. I've had once in 21 years, I gave a penultimate image to a client. They said, "We love it, fantastic, thank you so much." One time in 21 years, I was just like, "Really? Okay, I'm gonna go get some tequila. Like this is great. Like that's never happened before." So I think that the idea of, and that may sound depressing, but it's really, it just is what it is. Like, I mean, you can fight it if you want to fight it. You can definitely tell them, like, look, we scheduled this to be your end date, respectfully, we're happy to do the work, but I do have to charge you for it. I'm not saying that you should do it all for free, but I think in many ways, clients, when they come to you, unless they are paying you for your genius, and I think the number of people that get paid for their genius is very short. I think D-Box gets paid for their genius. I think Mirror Visuals gets paid for their genius. I think Tom Schaller. I think Dennis Elaine. Those guys get paid for their genius. Michael Reardon gets paid for his genius. Lebbeus Woods got paid for his genius. All those people get paid for their genius. Some people get paid for their genius. Most of us we're trying to get the mortgage together, right? So I think the best that I can say about being done really is that initial curve, is that fundamentally you're going to reach a point on any image where people can tweak it to the nth degree, but it's not going to really get any better. It's not going to really get any better. And if you feel like you're at the point where it's really not going to get any better, and you feel like you're at the point where the client said, you know, it was due the 27th, and here it is the 2nd of the next month, and they're still making notes, then, you know, you need to be a business person and just step up and say, hey, like, look, dude, like, we were finished on the 27th. It's not getting any better, but it's just cost, you know, you're asking me to pick up notes that you really should have had. And you just need to evaluate it, you know, like if, you know, I mean, if you're doing that for, I mean, you just need to evaluate it. You know, I was having a conversation with an architect friend of mine. Like, one of the hardest things that they have to do in a business sense is conveying to their project managers to understand the context. So if you have a client that you've never worked with before and they're doing that to you and you don't feel like there's any kind of respect going on and they just feel like you're gonna be there for them forever after at no extra charge, then you either need to fire them or you need to start having that discussion. Meanwhile, there's other firms like, okay, like they did, you know, $350,000 with business stuff last year, and now things are going on another month or another week because their client is raining down on them. Like, you know what? I'm going to be there for you. I'm going to be there for them because I know, like, they're having to take a bath from their client, and I'm not gonna make their lives hell. But the best thing I can tell you about being done is when you reach that asymptote, you know, you need to be conscious of what that asymptote is and know where you are. You know where you are in that production. Like, you know it's not going to get any better. I know it's not going to really get any better. You're just having me move pixels, but it ain't getting any better. So, is that helpful? Okay. Yeah, it's just being business-like. And when you figure out how to do that, tell me. That would be awesome. Okay. MaxScript editor. Okay, so this is another one that we wrote kind of in-house. And what this does is, you can see here, base invisible matte. So what this does, the last thing that the project manager really is responsible for doing, and junior artists can do this too, is they just open up Max and they run the script. So this is a script that we set up. What it does is it comes in here and you're going to tell it, see. You're going to tell it the name of the project directory, and it's automatically going to hunt for meshes xref base, meshes xref invisible, and meshes xref matte. It's going to hunt for those directories. All right. Going to get files, all, hit go. Okay. This is just, the script I think is working. It's just a matter of its backup files. I'm trying to think of a good like drum beat to do this too, but okay. So it completes the batch, and what that did is that it went through the base directory and it looked at all these files, and it said if you have an invisible version of one of those files, it'll update it. And what it does is it just goes through all those objects in that base file, and it opens them up. It goes through all of the objects that are in that xref, and it makes them invisible. Then it senses what other ones from the base directory are in the mat, and it opens up all of those objects, and it tells it, make it a V-Ray mat object. Or V-Ray, a mat. Language escapes me right now. But make it a mat object. Everybody understands what I'm saying, right? Okay. So basically, your job at the end of the day as project manager is you get to log in. You get to log into your machine from home, wherever, at the concert. I've done it by the side of the highway, you know. You open up, go into your machine, you open up Max, you run that script on the directory. You have now matte versions of of the scenes that you need matte versions of. You have invisible versions of the scenes you have invisible of. And then you come into your monitor and you activate. That's it. So The ideas then get rendered overnight. Passes appear next morning for the senior artists. They cobble them together, send them off to the client, and you do it again. Okay? No such thing as being done. Now you might ask, like, I mean, there's times where it can be incredibly onerous redoing Photoshop work and redoing Photoshop work and redoing Photoshop work. Okay, so we'll talk about that in the afternoon. Okay, but right now I think I'm about done for the morning. So if anybody had questions, I'm more than happy to answer them. Yeah.
So what that script does is nobody ever really goes in and works on the invisible model or the map
You
model.
should not touch those.
Okay.
Nobody ever touches those. Now you can if you want to. Like sometimes sometimes you have a beastly XREF like that has a bunch of furniture in it that's not proxied, for instance, right? Then sometimes you end up having to do that. And you tell the junior artist, like, look, your file is not processing with that batch script, so you need to select everything, make it matte, and then save it off into the matte directory. But basically, the idea is that nobody ever touches anything except the base directory. Okay. Does everybody see how that might be helpful in getting out of the door at a reasonable time? Okay.
Just one more question. How do you deal with the concept phases of the project? Like you have any meeting or anything at the beginning of the project to develop like concepts like color schemes and angle, time of the day, season, this kind of thing that you can...
Yeah, we do. I mean, usually it's in the proposal, or it's usually in the discussion.
So involving the client and... or the whole team, or who works with this? The senior artist or the manager?
It's usually me. It's usually me saying like, look, I think that this would be the best time to do this, or it's a client. I mean, like, I mean, I should say it's definitely when you're working. I don't know. It's funny. I mean. It's mostly client driven. Most of our business, almost like 90% of our business is just repeat clients, and so they know, and they know they'll ask you, if we can do an evening shot of this, I mean whereas I think architects are very comfortable, kind of asking for what they want, and then. Developers, I think you have to work a little harder for. Like we'll do when we're doing illustrations for people totally outside of. If we're doing illustrations for developers, that's a different thing. Like then we definitely will want to recommend. We'll develop. Say it's a film, we'll develop a creative treatment. When we'll kind of talk about what we think would work well. We'll give them examples of what we think of previous ones that would work well that are similarly styled. Do we talk about material palettes or color palettes? No, honestly, those are derived from the architecture themselves. We don't try and project really too much as far as that goes. And if people are totally outside of developers or architects, we'll actually go so far as to do sketches in Photoshop and say, like, here's this, It's a lot of info.
Sorry. Well, I can see how the process that you have on the pipeline would work for a project where you involve 4 or 8 different people. I'm curious to know, like for example, when you're placing furniture or when you're placing trees, you need to have the master file in place in order to know that where everything is being placed. So do you have one master file, and different number of copies from that master file, so that the junior artist can know exactly where to place the furniture, or you have, or they create their own files, they XREF the base file, they know where to place it, and then they simply unload the XREF?
Yeah, the project manager is really, first off, responsible for determining the origin of everything. Okay, so the project manager is really responsible for determining the origin and then distributing. That XREF is your responsibility. That XREF is your responsibility. That XREF is your responsibility. The daily process of being able. That's a great question. Again, the daily process is that you're working on your XREF, but you're XREFing in to that file. Basically yesterday's version of, say, the site. Say, for instance, you're placing trees. You need to have that site XREF in there as you're placing your trees, right? And you just set your XREF at, I've never had the courage to try it, but ostensibly you can set your XREF at overlay. You know that button? The XREF overlay. So the next file won't actually call the one that's XREF'd in. Does that answer the question?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
The other question I have is with respect to shadows. Every time that we work in a kind of similar fashion to this, we have different files that cast the shadows from the trees, files that cast the shadows from cars, the base file. Well, sometimes it will come with shadows, or sometimes it won't. But once we overlay all the different shadows, there's always a difference, and it's different than if you were casting the shadows from the same single file. Is there? I'm curious to know how your studio works around with different shadows that overlay, so that they don't overlap and become darker in those areas.
Yeah, that's that skylight pass, that GI pass, and Gordon will talk about that this afternoon. But that's fundamentally, what we use. And then, sometimes you just have to tweak it. You just have, you can get it pretty darn close. It's still like contact shadows for cars are never quite as dark as they really should be. So usually we'll double up theirs with AO passes.
Thank you.
No worries.
Say you're I don't have a complete understanding on how you get to the invisible model, the matte model. For example, your junior artist is building a desk.
Yeah.
And he applies the materials to the desk. At what point does that desk get into these other folders where then, at the end of the day, you said your senior guy will come in and run this script that turns everything in that folder to an invisible or a matte? Is the junior artist taking his desk model and putting it in those folders?
He doesn't touch those folders. What this script does is it pulls files from the base folder. It opens them up in Max.
Okay, so it's not X-referencing them. It's opening them and saving a new file.
It's opening them and then saving versions of them that are invisible, or saving versions of them that are matte.
Okay.
Okay? So nobody has to touch. Like, we used to do it by hand. Forget it. What happens is
human error mess.
Human error mess. Yeah. Human error mess, but not only human error mess, but what happens is the same thing with trying to set up render passes at the end of the day. What happens is that you have to stop working on 3D at 3 o'clock in the afternoon because you're so worried that your overnight renders aren't going to work right. So you don't actually maximize the time that you could be spending building. Right? So there are a couple things that, and then inevitably, like even when you stopped at 3 o'clock in the afternoon to start worrying about making sure these other things were totally kosher, blah blah blah, 25% of our passes would still be messed up, and then your render, and it's just like, oh my God. So what you're trying to do over the course of this thing is you're really just trying to make the number of variables smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller to the point where the variables are nothing more than people changing a little bit of 3D and then opening up the Photoshop file. Like that. That's what you're trying to do, because you want that end of that process, that asymptote, you want to be nothing more than, I'm going to take those, that client had a comment about that shelf, I'm going to take those vertices and move them, 3 inches this way, and then you save the file into the base file and you run the script restart the passes, open up Photoshop.
One last question, and I'm done. With your junior artists, they're making that desk. We have crashes. You know, what I do in my office, we often save up numbers. By the end of a project, we may have, you know, 059. You know.
Oh my God.
Do your artists do that, and then do they have to save back to the original XREF name, or how do you handle that? Are these just such small pieces it doesn't ever run into a large problem?
That's our typical directory at the end of a project. So what that script does is it only identifies max files in the directory. So what you've done over the course of the project, 15th, 17th, 21st, 23rd, 25th, is that you've saved the file, but then you put a 00, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And so it's not seen by Max. It's not seen by the script at all, but you basically just updated what is actually in that file. So that's so those are a bunch of XREFs that you can see. So anyway, that probably answers your question, right? Okay, so end of the day, I'm a junior artist. I save off. I'm working in base file, right? I save it off and I call it basex.max. Then I come into the base folder. I change this to be. If you change file, yep, that's exactly what I want to do. You know, and then you go and reach and rename. Let's pretend this was the. Let's pretend this.
Now you answered me. Now the renaming is what I was curious about.
Yep, yep. So basically, what you're doing is say this is the file I just saved off. I saved it basex, so I didn't overwrite the night before in case there was a total disaster. I didn't overnight, and then I come back and I just remove the X from my. And now it's picked up. Okay.
Alternately, could you have added that into the script so the script would look for the highest number, and then you wouldn't have to do the renaming?
Well, Max won't recognize if it's the 0, 0. I mean, that's the file extension.
But I mean, if they were all Max files and you just save
no,
as...
because the RP Manager file, the first thing you did was you set it to tell it to use a specific XREF. So no, you would not. This last script has actually nothing to do with RP Manager. Okay, the XREFs, the way XREFs work is they have to be the exact same name. Otherwise, you lose the linking.
One other question. With the RP Manager file that you created, you stepped us through, are you able to reuse any of that from project to project, or do you have to recreate that?
You can no, you can't, because each project is going to link different XREFs, and so because the XREFs are located under a project name, I mean, you can open up them, but it's not worth it. It's better just to start again and start afresh. And it's really just because the XREFs are located in a particular location, and that is job dependent. And the number of views is job dependent. And fundamentally, the senior artist may come back and say, I really need this pass, and this pass, which wasn't in the last one. So it's a little bit of work to set up. It goes a lot faster once you've done it a few times. But you have to do it once. You don't have to do it every night. Do it once, at the beginning of the project, before you've received it. And it's part of how you're going to delegate tasks, which is what you have to do as a project manager early on, and it's part of how you're going to build that image in the end. So it's time well spent early on, and you're doing it at a time when things aren't quite so crazy. That's the other thing. It's just like the more that you can do when not everybody is panicked. The more that you can do while not everybody is panicked, the better off you're going to be. It's just that's when mistakes happen. It's when you're panicked. You have to get it done. That's when mistakes happen. So,
John, so you're talking about delegating tasks and a daily conversation with customers whenever it's possible, right? And a distributed teams of junior artists and senior artists. So when the notes come in, and they need to be assigned to people, right? So everybody knows exactly what to do before 5:30 so they can go home. How do you track that? Do you have any tool recommendations? Do you have any, I mean, or is this just an informal conversation in the office?
Well, it's more of an informal conversation. Like sometimes, and you have to kind of keep it seat of the pants a little bit, because sometimes the notes will be universally kind of just everywhere, right? Sometimes they will be. Sometimes they're about specific image things, and then those things need to go to the senior artist, and they need to deal with those. Some things, though, are geometry, and then when it's geometry, it should go to the person whose XREF it is that has that geometry in it. You know, so that's really, it ends up being self-selecting. Like your job, you know, Josh, your job is to take it from nothing to a finished XREF, you know, and I think that realistically, you know, we're going to start getting them images on Tuesday. You need to leave off like at a reasonable stopping point at the end of the day every day, but you have really until Thursday you have to absolutely have this model finished. And then when they come back with notes, like if that's part of your geometry, you're responsible for doing that. That said, sometimes there's nothing on something, you know, and then there's tons on something else. And then at that point in time, very often we will say, like, here, you take care of these pieces, you take care of these pieces. You, the junior artist, are responsible for integrating. Even though this is part of your XREF, you have enough other things to do. You take then the pieces from so-and-so and incorporate them into yours. And so you can both be working on it at the same time. So